we dive into today's chilling story, I request you to hit the like button and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, but encourages me to keep scaring you. 3, 2, 1. If it's done, let's begin tonight's story, The Shadows in the Room. Chapter 1. Before the Move. Jamie Thompson's life before the move to Waterloo had been one of stability, comfort, and routine. The Thompsons had lived in a large, 2-story home in a well-to-do suburb of Toronto. The house had 4 bedrooms, a spacious backyard, and was filled with the warmth of happy memories. Jamie had grown up there, surrounded by friends he had known since kindergarten. His days were filled with soccer practice, video games, and sleepovers with his closest friends. He had a dog named Max, a golden retriever who was his constant companion. Life was good. His parents, Mark and Emily Thompson, had worked hard to provide this life for their only child. Mark was an accountant, methodical and dependable, while Emily managed a small but successful catering business. They were a practical, hard-working couple who had always been cautious with their finances. They believed in saving for the future, investing wisely, and living within their means. For years, this approach had served them well. But then came the housing bubble. As property values soared and the cost of living increased, the Thompson family's careful planning was thrown into disarray. Mark's firm faced cutbacks, and Emily's catering business took a hit as clients tightened their budgets. The rising mortgage payments became unsustainable, and after months of struggling to keep up, they made the difficult decision to sell their beloved home and downsize to a smaller, more affordable property. For Jamie, the move felt like the end of the world. He couldn't understand why they had to leave everything behind. The house, the neighborhood, his friends. He resented his parents for uprooting him, though deep down, he knew they had no choice. Still, the move felt like a betrayal, and he found it difficult to forgive them. The new house, located on the outskirts of Waterloo, was nothing like their old one. It was smaller, older, and had none of the charm or comfort of their previous home. Jamie felt like a stranger in his own life, and the sense of loss weighed heavily on him. His parents tried to reassure him that things would get better, but Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house, that it was more than just a bad situation. Something was off, even if he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Chapter 2. The First Night in Waterloo. The first night in the new house was one Jamie would never forget. His room, tucked away on the 2nd floor, was small and sparsely furnished. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards creaked with every step. Jamie missed his old room, with its bright colors and familiar posters. Now, he lay in bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, trying to adjust to the eerie silence of the house. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Sleep didn't come easily that night. When Jamie finally drifted off, it was restless and uneasy. He dreamed of dark corridors and endless hallways, of being chased by something he couldn't see. And then he awoke. Except he wasn't fully awake. His eyes were open, but his body was paralyzed. He could feel the heavy weight on his chest, the suffocating pressure that made it impossible to breathe. At first, Jamie thought he was still dreaming, but then he saw it. The figure in the corner of his room. It was a dark shape, barely distinguishable from the shadows, but it was there, watching him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. The figure seemed to grow closer, more defined, as if feeding off his fear. And then Just as suddenly as it had begun, the paralysis lifted. Jamie gasped for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was gone. For the rest of the night, Jamie stayed awake, terrified that if he closed his eyes, it would return. The next morning, he told his parents about the experience, but they dismissed it as a nightmare. "It's just the stress of the move," his mother said, ruffling his hair. "You'll feel better once you settle in." But Jamie wasn't so sure. Chapter 3. The Parents' Struggles. Mark and Emily Thompson were trying their best to adapt to their new circumstances, but the strain of the move was taking its toll on them as well. Mark had always been the rock of the family, but lately he seemed more distant, preoccupied with work and the mounting bills. He spent long hours at the office, trying to make up for lost income, and when he was home, he was often too exhausted to do much more than collapse on the couch. Emily, too, was struggling. Her catering business, once a source of pride and accomplishment, had dwindled to a trickle of clients. The move had forced her to give up her commercial kitchen space, and now she was trying to run the business from their cramped new kitchen. It wasn't the same, and she missed the sense of fulfillment that her work had once brought her. They both tried to put on a brave face for Jamie, but the cracks in their facade were starting to show. The stress of their new reality was weighing them down, and the house, with its strange atmosphere, wasn't helping. Emily had always prided herself on being able to create a warm, inviting home, but no matter how much she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with this place. Mark, ever the pragmatist, dismissed her concerns as nerves. "It's an old house," he said. "Of course, it's going to creak and groan. We just need to get used to it." But deep down, even he couldn't deny the unease that seemed to hang in the air. Chapter 4. The Haunting Begins. As the days turned into weeks, Jamie's experiences with sleep paralysis grew more frequent and more terrifying. Each time, the dark figure in the corner of his room seemed to come closer, its form becoming more distinct. What had once been a vague shadow was now a tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It never spoke, but its presence was suffocating, filling the room with a sense of dread that lingered even after Jamie woke. During the day, Jamie tried to carry on as best he could. He enrolled in the local school, but making new friends was difficult. The other kids were polite enough, but they already had their own groups, and Jamie found it hard to fit in. He missed his old friends, missed the sense of belonging he had once taken for granted. At home, things were no better. The house, with its dark corners and the strange noises, seemed to be closing in on him. He often felt like he was being watched, even during the day. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the creaks and groans of the old house no longer felt like just the sounds of an aging structure. There was something else at play, something sinister. It was during one of these restless days that Jamie stumbled upon the journal. Chapter 5. The Journal. Jamie had been exploring the attic, a dusty, forgotten space filled with old furniture and boxes of forgotten belongings. He wasn't sure what had drawn him up there, but as he sifted through the debris, he found a small, leather-bound journal tucked away behind a stack of old books. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. The journal belonged to a boy named William, who had lived in the house over a century ago. Jamie's curiosity piqued. He began to read. The entries started innocently enough, describing William's daily life in the late 1800s. He wrote about his family, his school, and the various chores he had to do around the house. But as Jamie read on, the tone of the journal grew darker. William began to describe strange occurrences in the house. Footsteps in the hallway when no one was there, doors opening and closing on their own, and a feeling of being watched. And then, just like Jamie, William began to experience sleep paralysis. Chapter 6. William's Descent. The journal entries became more frantic as William detailed his encounters with the dark figure. He wrote of waking in the middle of the night, unable to move, with the figure standing at the foot of his bed. Each time it seemed closer, more defined, and William was convinced that it was trying to take something from him. His very life, perhaps. William's fear was palpable in the pages of the journal. He wrote of sleepless nights, of trying to stay awake to avoid the figure, but it was always there, waiting for him. His family didn't believe him, dismissing his experiences as nightmares or the result of an overactive imagination. The final entries were filled with despair. William wrote of a feeling trapped, of knowing that the figure would eventually take him. His last entry was a desperate plea for help, but there was no one left to listen. Jamie felt a deep connection to the boy who had lived in the house so long ago. They had shared the same terror, the same feeling of helplessness. And now, Jamie was certain that whatever had haunted William was now haunting him. Chapter 7. The Parents' Realization. As Jamie's encounters with the dark figure grew more frequent, his parents began to notice the change in him. He became withdrawn, jumpy, and pale. His grades at school started to slip, and he stopped doing the things he used to enjoy. Mark and Emily, caught up in their own struggles, had initially brushed off Jamie's complaints as part of the stress of the move. But now, they couldn't ignore the signs that something was seriously wrong. One night, after yet another sleepless night for Jamie, Emily sat him down and asked him to tell her everything. Reluctantly, Jamie recounted his experiences, the sleep paralysis, the dark figure, and the journal he had found in the attic. At first, Emily was skeptical, but as Jamie spoke, she could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that she had been feeling in the house herself. She shared what Jamie had told her with Mark, who, though practical by nature, couldn't ignore the change in his son or the strange occurrences in the house that even he had started to notice. The Thompsons knew they had to do something. Chapter 8. The Final Confrontation. Desperate for answers, the Thompsons decided to seek out the history of the house. They visited the local library where they found old records and newspaper clippings about the house's previous inhabitants. It turned out that several families who had lived in the house over the years had reported strange occurrences, and many of them had moved out suddenly, much like the Thompsons had been forced to move in. But it was the story of William that struck them the most. According to the records, William had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was listed as illness, but there were rumors in the town that he had been found in his bed, seemingly asleep, but never to wake again. Armed with this knowledge, the Thompsons returned home, determined to confront whatever was haunting their son. That night, as Jamie lay in bed, the familiar paralysis took hold. The dark figure appeared once again, closer than ever before. But this time, Jamie wasn't alone. His parents had stayed with him, determined to protect their son. As the figure loomed over Jamie, his parents called out to it, demanding it leave their son alone. The figure hesitated, its form flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, it seemed to waver, as if unsure of itself, and then, with a final, chilling whisper, it vanished, leaving behind only the oppressive silence of the night. Chapter 9. A New Beginning. The next morning, the house felt different. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over it for so long seemed to have lifted. Jamie, for the first time in weeks, felt like he could breathe again. The sleep paralysis didn't return, and the dark figure was gone. The Thompsons, though relieved, decided that it was time to move on from the house. They put it up for sale and found a new home, this time making sure it was a place that felt right for their family. As they packed up their belongings, Jamie found himself thinking about William and the others who had lived in the house before him. He wondered if they had finally found peace, if the dark figure had been banished for good. As they drove away from the house for the last time, Jamie felt a sense of closure. The nightmare was over, and it was time to start a new chapter in their lives. Epilogue. The final entry. Years later, when Jamie was grown and had a family of his own, he found himself thinking back to that old house in Waterloo. He had never forgotten the fear he had felt, or the dark figure that had haunted his nights. But he had also never forgotten the journal, which he had kept with him all these years. One evening, as the sun set outside his window, Jamie took out the journal and began to read it again. The words were as chilling as ever, but now, with the passage of time, they felt like a distant memory, a ghost from his past. As he closed the journal, Jamie whispered a quiet thank you to William, wherever he might be. The darkness had tried to take him, but he had survived, and now he would make sure that his own children would never have to face the same terror. The journal went back into the drawer where it would remain, a silent reminder of the shadows that had once lurked in the corners of his room.